Hello, everyone. So next we're going to talk about experimental and quantitative psychology. And so this section of your book really only focuses in on the quantitative part. And certainly if you want to make good money, especially as a consultant, having those statistical abilities as a psychologist or as someone interested in numbers and interested in sort of the intersection of numbers and psychology certainly will get you there. If you decide to do a graduate program in another field in psychology, if you can get more quantitative courses, that will certainly make you more appealing on the job market. People are always looking for more folks that can help with quantitative analyses. But experimental psychology, which they don't go into very much here because they sort of put that off to the end to graduate careers, is a really diverse field within psychology. So I'm going to go ahead and do a quick screen share here for you. There we go. Couldn't find the screen. It's just like being in live class. And you will be able to see. Now, this is from my department where I got my PhD in clinical psychology, Kent State University, their Department of Psychological Sciences. And what I really like about how they lay out their training areas is they show you how sort of subspecialties in clinical psychology map onto the subspecialties in experimental psychology. And these are certainly by no means exhaustive in terms of what you can do with a degree in experimental psychology. But again, it gives you a nice point of comparison in terms of, well, I'm really interested in this clinically. How would that translate to experimental psychology? So I'm going to sort of scroll up here so you can see this a little bit better. So if we think about what we talked about last module and thinking about, biopsychology, neuropsychology, you can do clinical neuropsychology where you would be doing the assessments, right? Doing research that was very applied, maybe helping with treatment planning or actual treatment for cognitive difficulties. But if you're interested in that and you're just not sure that being a clinician is for you, or you are very passionate about research, there are a couple different ways you can go. You can do a cognitive psychology track. So for those of you who have had classes with other members of our department, that would be like Dr. Ariel at Virginia Wesleyan University. They study things like memory, thinking, as we talked about last module. Or you can do behavioral neuroscience, where you're studying the interaction of the brain and behavior through a research lens. Then there's developmental science. So in clinical, this would be a track so that you would focus on treating child and adolescent people. But you can do the same thing through focusing on research, and then that would be developmental psychology. So that's sort of the research side of the what we call clinical child psychology coin. Okay, so as you can see, these things are starting to map really, really well. Okay, and then there's physical and mental health. So my PhD, I was on the adult psychopathology track because I looked particularly at things in adults, and my specialty is eating disorders. So I was looking at that in adults. But you can also maybe choose to focus more in on assessment. So your research and maybe even your clinical work would focus on assessing people for personality issues, things along those lines. And then you can also do health psychology, which we've touched upon in previous modules. And then even though I was on the adult psychopathology track, I did get quite a few experiences doing both assessment and health psychology. But again, flip the coin. And if you're interested in this experimental piece, there was a health psych track and there was also a social psychology track. So you would get a PhD in either of those. You would do research focused on those things. And then, you would look to work for some sort of foundation doing research, a company, or perhaps work in academia where you would do your research and teach. So I think a lot of people think you can only be a clinician, and especially like, oh, well, if I'm interested in clinical type things, that's the only thing I can do. No, not at all. And one thing I do have to say is that oftentimes, not always, depending on the area of specialty, but oftentimes the experimental PhDs, right, where you're not doing that clinical work and that clinical training, are much easier to get into because sort of everyone thinks that they want to be a PhD in clinical psychology. So I hope that looking at that gives you some idea of how experimental psychologists work. So they are going to be focusing on research and perhaps teaching, and in basically any topic, any area of psychology, you can be an experimental psychologist and focus on that area. And we need those experimental psychologists because they do the really important basic science work that's the foundation for everything you do in, say, clinical or school or industrial organizational psychology. So I hope that helps sort of illuminate what these things are like. And I hope you enjoy reading and finding out more about experimental and quantitative psychology.